Mom kept saying she'd signed papers. I'd brush her silver hair back from her forehead, the way I'd done every morning for 3 years, and she'd look at me with those clouded blue eyes. "Sophie, I signed something. Blake said it would help you." Then she'd forget, her mind drifting back to some memory from 1987, when her 3 children were still small and the world made sense. I thought it was just the dementia talking. Another confused loop in the fractured circuitry of her mind. I was wrong. My name is Sophia Bennett, and in August 2022, I was 52 years old and living in my childhood home in Seattle. Not because I wanted to be there, but because my mother needed me. Margaret Bennett, sharp as a tack until 2019 when early-onset dementia started stealing her piece by piece, couldn't live alone anymore. So I'd packed up my graphic design business in California, left the career I'd spent 2 decades building, and moved back to the rain-soaked city of my youth. The decision hadn't been easy. I'd had contracts with 3 major clients, a studio apartment in San Francisco that I loved, a life that was finally, at 50, exactly what I wanted it to be. But when Dr. Patterson called me in March 2020 to say Mom couldn't manage on her own anymore, there was never really a question of who would step up. Blake was too busy. He'd made that clear during our family Zoom call about Mom's diagnosis. He was a VP at a tech company, he explained, traveling constantly, managing a team of 40 people. His executive waterfront condo wasn't set up for caregiving. He could contribute financially, sure, but physically being there? That wasn't realistic for his lifestyle. Cassie had different excuses. Her boutique marketing firm was just taking off. She had a husband who didn't do well with medical situations. Her kids needed stability. She'd visit regularly, she promised, and she'd help coordinate care. But live-in caregiving? She couldn't manage that. So it was me, the middle child, the artistic one, the daughter who'd chosen creativity over corporate ladders and family over ambition. The one whose life could be reorganized because, after all, graphic design was flexible, wasn't it? I could work from anywhere. I didn't have kids or a husband to consider. I was perfect for the job. I told myself I'd agreed because I wanted to. Because those late-night conversations with Mom over tea when I was growing up meant something. Because she'd supported my decision to pursue art school when Dad wanted me to study business. Because she'd been there through my divorce, through the lean years when my design business was barely surviving, through every failure and small victory of my adult life. My brother Blake, 54 and living in his executive waterfront condo, visited twice a month. My sister Cassie, 49 and busy with her boutique marketing firm, came by maybe once every 6 weeks. They'd stay for an hour, pat Mom's hand, tell me I was doing great, then disappear back to their perfectly curated lives. I didn't resent them. Not then. I told myself caregiving was a choice, even as I watched my client list shrink to nothing, even as my savings account dwindled, even as my friends in California stopped calling because I was never available anymore. I told myself it mattered more than career trajectories and retirement accounts and the freedom I'd spent 50 years building. I told myself caregiving was a choice, that I'd wanted to be there for Mom the way she'd been there for me. That watching her forget my name, forget where she was, forget that Dad had died in 2015, that this was meaningful work. Sacred, even. But the reality was brutal in ways I'd never anticipated. The first time she looked at me without recognition, I thought my heart would stop. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 months into my return. I'd brought her breakfast, scrambled eggs the way she liked them, toast cut diagonally, and she'd stared at me like I was an intruder. "Who are you?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. "Where's my daughter?" "I'm your daughter, Mom. It's me, Sophie." She'd shaken her head, agitated. "Sophie's in California. She has her own life. Who are you?" I'd left the room and cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes. The lucid moments were harder in some ways than the confusion. She'd surface from the fog for an hour or an afternoon, suddenly present and aware, and we'd talk like we used to. She'd ask about my work, my friends, whether I was happy, and I'd lie, tell her everything was fine, that I was managing beautifully. Then the fog would roll back in, and she'd be gone again. But some days, when I was helping her to the bathroom at 3 a.m. or cleaning up another accident, or explaining for the 5th time that no, we couldn't call Dad because he wasn't coming home, I'd feel a flicker of something dark. Not quite resentment, not quite regret. Just a whisper asking, where are Blake and Cassie right now? Probably sleeping soundly. Blake would text sometimes, how's Mom doing? I'd send updates. He'd respond with thumbs-up emojis or brief acknowledgements. Sometimes he'd Venmo me money for groceries or medical supplies. Like I was a hired caregiver, he was managing remotely rather than his sister who'd given up everything. Cassie would call every few weeks, usually while I was in the middle of something. Bathing Mom, preparing medication, dealing with a doctor's appointment. Just checking in, she'd say brightly. Let me know if you need anything. Then she'd hang up before I could actually list what I needed. Relief, sleep, adult conversation, acknowledgement that what I was doing mattered. Mom had been a meticulous planner before the dementia. In 2018, when she was 75 and still herself, she'd updated her will with her attorney. Everything split equally, 1/3 to each of her 3 children. The estate was substantial, $2.8 million between the house, retirement accounts, stocks, and cash. Not a fortune, but enough to matter. Enough to be worth protecting. I never thought about the money. I was too busy trying to preserve what was left of her dignity. The signing papers thing started after Blake and Cassie's visit in early August. They'd come together, which was unusual. Stayed for 3 hours, which was even more unusual. When they left, Mom seemed more agitated than normal. She kept opening and closing her hands, staring at her fingers like they belonged to someone else. Did I sign something? She asked me that night while I was giving her medication. Not that I know of, Mom. What did you sign? Her face crumpled with confusion. I don't. Blake said papers, to help you. I assumed they'd had her sign a birthday card or something harmless. Blake's birthday was in September. That had to be it. But she kept mentioning it. For 3 days, the same refrain. I signed papers. Blake said it was for you. On the 4th day, I decided to look. I found them in her nightstand drawer, tucked beneath her reading glasses, and the romance novel she'd been stuck on the same page of for 6 months. A manila folder, crisp and new, with documents inside. My hands started shaking before my brain could process what I was seeing. I sat down on the edge of her bed, the afternoon light slanting through the lace curtains she'd hung when I was in high school. The room smelled like her lavender lotion and the faint antiseptic odor of medical supplies. Somewhere downstairs, the TV was playing a cooking show she'd never watch. I opened the folder, a new will, dated August 7th, 2022. Just 4 days ago. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was crystal clear. I, Margaret Bennett, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate to Blake Bennett and Cassandra Bennett in equal shares. Sophia Bennett was mentioned once, in the section explicitly revoking any previous bequests to her. There was more. A power of attorney, granting Blake complete control over Mom's finances. Effective immediately. Authority to access her accounts, sell property, make medical decisions, everything. Property transfer documents, moving the house title from Margaret Bennett to Blake Bennett and Cassandra Bennett. The house I was sitting in, the house where I'd given up my life to care for our mother, all signed by my mother. Her signature was there, shaky and uncertain, the M in Margaret trailing off like she'd forgotten halfway through how to write her own name. Nothing like her bold, confident signature from the 2018 will I'd seen in her attorney's files. Witnessed and notarized by someone named David Chen. I didn't recognize the name. I read the documents 3 times. Then I sat there in the failing afternoon light in the room where I'd slept as a child and tried to remember how to breathe. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped steel bands around my ribs and was slowly tightening them. The betrayal hit in waves. First the shock, bright and disorienting, like I'd been slapped awake from a dream. Then the hurt, deep and consuming, settling into my bones. Then something else, something that tasted like metal and made my jaw clench. Rage. Because my mother had dementia. She couldn't legally sign these documents. She didn't even remember signing them an hour afterward. And Blake and Cassie knew that. They'd been there during the diagnosis. They'd sat in the neurologist's office when Dr. Patterson explained that Mom's capacity to make complex decisions was severely compromised. They knew. And they'd done this anyway. I called Blake that night. Kept my voice steady, professional. I found some documents in Mom's nightstand, a new will, POA, property transfers. You know anything about that? The pause was half a second too long. Oh, yeah. Mom wanted to update some things, make sure everything was in order. She has dementia, Blake. She can't legally make these decisions. She was having a good day. His tone shifted, defensive now. The notary certified she was of sound mind. It's all legal, Sophie. Don't make this difficult. A good day? I heard my voice rise. She doesn't remember what year it is. She called me Jennifer yesterday. That's her dead sister's name. She doesn't have good days anymore. Look, if you have concerns, talk to your attorney. But everything was done properly. Mom's wishes are clear. He hung up. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the timeline. Blake and Cassie had visited on August 7th. That was one of Mom's worst days in recent memory. She'd been particularly confused, asking for Dad repeatedly, convinced it was 1994. I'd texted Blake that morning, actually, told him Mom was having a rough day. Maybe they should reschedule. They'd come anyway. The next morning, I hired an elder law attorney named Justin Cole. He reviewed the documents in his downtown office, his expression darkening with each page. The office was on the 14th floor of a building overlooking Elliott Bay, all glass and polished wood, and the kind of quiet competence that comes with 30 years of practice. Your mother's signature shows clear signs of cognitive impairment, he said, pointing to the wavering letters with a gold pen. Look here. She started to write her middle name, then stopped. Crossed it out, started again. This isn't someone who understood what she was signing. And the timing is suspicious. You have her medical records? I had everything. 3 years of neuropsychological evaluations, doctor's notes, medication logs. I'd kept meticulous records, because that's what good caregivers do. It was all there. The steady decline in cognitive function, the documented bad days, the assessment from just 2 weeks before August 7th that showed moderate to severe impairment. Justin filed for an emergency injunction to void the documents. Then he brought in Tyler Rodriguez, a forensic document examiner who'd testified in dozens of elder abuse cases. Tyler spent 2 hours examining Mom's signature under magnification, comparing it to her signatures from before the dementia, taking photographs and measurements. This signature was signed under duress or confusion, he told us. See these hesitation marks? The pressure variations? Your mother's hand was shaking. She paused multiple times. This is textbook cognitive impairment. But we needed more than expert opinions. We needed proof of intent. I'm going to request their phone records and communications, Justin said, closing the file. If this was planned, and I believe it was, there'll be evidence. People can't help themselves. They text, they email, they document their crimes. I didn't know what they'd find. I was still hoping, in some desperate corner of my mind, that this was a misunderstanding, that Blake and Cassie had genuinely thought they were helping somehow, even if their methods were wrong. That there was an explanation that didn't require me to accept that my own siblings were capable of this level of cruelty. The hope lasted exactly 11 days. That's when Justin called me into his office, his face grim, and handed me printouts of text messages recovered through legal discovery. Blake to Cassie, May 15, 2022. Mom's getting worse. We need to move fast before Sophia realizes we can get power of attorney. Cassie to Blake. June 3, 2022. Sophia's been playing martyr for years. She'll get nothing when Mom dies. We'll split 50-50. Blake to Emma, his wife, June 18, 2022. Can you draft new will docs? Mom's incompetent enough now that she'll sign anything. Emma to Blake, June 20, 2022. Documents ready. You'll need a compliant notary. Can't use Mom's regular attorney. He knows her too well. Blake to Cassie, July 1, 2022. Found a notary. My buddy David. He'll certify whatever we need. There were dozens more. Planning messages between Blake and his wife, Emma, who turned out to be a paralegal. She'd drafted the documents using templates from her firm, careful to make everything look legitimate. Blake's friend David Chen, the notary, had never even met my mother before August 7th. He'd agreed to certify that she was of sound mind in exchange for $500 without conducting any meaningful assessment. I read through them all, sitting in Justin's office, my hands getting colder with each new message. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This wasn't a misguided attempt to help. This was a conspiracy that had been planned over 3 months, executed with precision, designed specifically to steal my inheritance while I was busy caring for the mother they were exploiting. The worst message came from Blake to Cassie, sent on August 8th, the day after Mom signed. Done. She signed everything. Sophia has no clue. $2.8 split between us when the old lady dies. When the old lady dies, that's how he referred to our mother. The woman who'd raised him, who'd paid for his college education, who'd been there for every milestone and heartbreak and triumph of his 54 years on Earth. The old lady. I read that message sitting in Justin's office, and something inside me crystallized into pure, focused purpose. This wasn't just about the money. This was about protecting my mother from her own children. This was about making sure what they'd done, the exploitation, the manipulation, the casual cruelty, never happened to anyone else's parent. The investigation expanded. Tyler Rodriguez analyzed the signatures, confirming what we already knew. Mom's handwriting on August 7th showed severe tremors, hesitation marks, and stopping points consistent with someone who was confused and being rushed through a process she didn't understand. Dr. Patterson, Mom's neurologist, reviewed her medical records from early August. His testimony was damning. Based on her neuropsychological testing and my clinical observations, Margaret Bennett absolutely did not have the cognitive capacity to understand the legal implications of these documents on August 7, 2022. She was experiencing moderate to severe dementia at that time. We found other victims too. Emma, Blake's paralegal wife, had been involved in 3 similar cases over the past 5 years. Elderly clients with cognitive impairment, rushed document signings, convenient notaries. She developed a system. But there was something else in the messages, something that made the betrayal cut even deeper. Cassie to Blake, July 12, 2022. Sophia thinks she's going to get equal share for changing bedpans. She's got no idea what's coming. Blake to Cassie, July 14, 2022. Let her play nurse. Makes it easier for us to handle the real business. They'd watched me care for our mother. They'd thanked me for my sacrifice. And the whole time, they were planning to steal my inheritance as payment for their convenience. We filed civil suit in September 2022. Criminal charges followed in October: elder abuse, fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit theft. The district attorney was personally invested. Her own grandmother had been victimized in a similar scheme. The weight was excruciating. Months of depositions, motions, legal maneuvering. Blake hired an expensive attorney who argued that Mom had been competent, that the notary had done his job properly, that this was just a family dispute over money. But they couldn't explain the text messages. They couldn't explain why they'd chosen Mom's worst day in months to have her sign legal documents. They couldn't explain why Emma had drafted everything instead of using Mom's longtime attorney. The trial began in February 2024. 18 months after I'd found those documents in the nightstand drawer. 18 months of depositions and motions and sleepless nights. 18 months of caring for Mom while preparing to testify against my own siblings. I sat in the courtroom every single day. So did Mom, though she didn't really understand why we were there. Her attorney had advised against bringing her, but I insisted. The jury needed to see her. Needed to see what Blake and Cassie had exploited. She'd sit in the front row with the caregiver I'd hired for trial days, sometimes humming to herself, sometimes asking me who the people in the black robes were. Sometimes she'd point at Blake and Cassie at the defendant's table and ask me if I knew them. Her own children had become strangers. The day she asked that, "Sophie, who are those people?" Blake's attorney had to call for a recess because one of the jurors was crying. The prosecution presented the medical records first. Dr. Patterson took the stand in his gray suit, his reading glasses perched on his nose, and explained dementia in language the jury could understand. Imagine trying to sign your name while someone's shaking your arm and asking you to solve calculus problems and reminding you that you forgot to turn off the stove. That's what cognitive impairment feels like. You can physically write your name, but you have no idea what you're signing or why. He walked through Mom's decline, month by month, the neuropsychological tests showing progressive deterioration. The documented instances of confusion, agitation, memory loss. The assessment from July 2022, just 1 month before the signing, that explicitly stated she lacked capacity for complex decision-making. Then came the text messages. Read aloud in open court, each one landing like a physical blow. When the old lady dies, we split 50-50. I watched Blake's face when the prosecutor read that one. He kept his expression neutral, but his wife, Emma, sitting in the gallery because she was a co-defendant, looked like she might be sick. David Chen, the notary, took the stand on day 4. He was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. He admitted everything. Blake had paid him $500 to notarize the documents without properly verifying Mom's competency. He'd spent less than 5 minutes with her. He'd known something was off, but decided it wasn't his problem. "Did you believe Margaret Bennett understood what she was signing?" the prosecutor asked. "No," David said quietly. "She kept asking who I was and why I was there, but Blake said she was just having an off moment." The defense tried to discredit the medical evidence, suggesting that dementia patients have moments of lucidity. They brought in their own expert who testified that brief windows of competency were possible. But they couldn't explain the timeline. They couldn't explain the text messages showing premeditation. They couldn't explain why, if this was really about Mom's wishes, they'd hidden everything from her longtime attorney and the daughter who'd been caring for her. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Blake's face went white when the verdict was read. Cassie started crying. Emma sat perfectly still, her paralegal training keeping her composed even as her career evaporated. Sentencing came 30 days later. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd been practicing law since before I was born, did not mince words. "This court has seen many cases of elder financial abuse," she said, looking directly at Blake. "But rarely have I witnessed such calculated exploitation of a vulnerable parent by the very children entrusted with her care. You preyed on your mother's confusion and cognitive decline for personal financial gain. And in doing so, you attempted to punish the daughter who'd sacrificed her career and life to provide that care." Blake got 4 years in prison and a $200,000 fine. Cassie got 3 years and a $150,000 fine. Emma got 2 years and lost her law license permanently. The fraudulent documents were voided. Mom's original 2018 will was reinstated. She died 3 months later in June 2024. Peacefully in her sleep with me holding her hand. In her final weeks, she'd had a few moments of clarity. During one, she looked at me and said, "You're a good daughter, Sophie. I'm sorry about whatever happened. I don't remember, but I'm sorry." "It's okay, Mom," I told her. "You don't need to remember. Just rest." The estate was divided according to the 2018 will, $933,000 to each of us. But Blake and Cassie's shares were immediately garnished to pay their fines and my legal fees, $127,000 total. They ended up with significantly less than they would have received if they'd just let things be. I used my inheritance to establish the Margaret Bennett Elder Protection Fund. It provides free legal services to families fighting elder financial abuse. In the first year, we helped 89 families prevent or reverse fraudulent estate changes. Most of the cases involve similar patterns: adult children exploiting cognitively impaired parents, complicit notaries, forged documents. The cases broke my heart and fueled my purpose in equal measure. There was the 78-year-old man whose son had drained his retirement account while he was recovering from a stroke. The 82-year-old woman whose daughter had sold her house without her knowledge. The couple in their 90s whose nephew had convinced them to sign over power of attorney, then moved them into a nursing home and emptied their bank accounts. Each case was Mom's story in a different form. Each victory felt like justice for her, for me, for every family who'd been torn apart by greed. The fund also does education. We teach families to recognize warning signs, to keep meticulous medical records, to question sudden legal changes. We've partnered with the Alzheimer's Association and several elder law firms across Washington state. We've developed a checklist for families, a roadmap for what to do if they suspect abuse, resources for finding help. I also testified before the state legislature in March 2025. The hearing room was packed. Families who'd been victimized, attorneys who'd fought these cases, advocates for elder rights. I told them about Mom, about the ease with which Blake and Emma had manipulated the system, about how many vulnerable elderly people were losing their life savings to their own children. I told them about finding those documents in the nightstand drawer, about the text messages calling her the old lady, about sitting in a courtroom watching my mother not recognize her own children while they were on trial for exploiting her. My mother worked her entire life, I said, my voice steady, despite the emotion pressing against my throat. She raised 3 children. She built a retirement that would let her live with dignity. And in her most vulnerable moment, when her mind was failing and she needed protection, 2 of those children saw an opportunity instead of a parent. The room was silent. I was lucky. I found the documents before she died. But most families aren't that lucky. Most only discover the fraud after their loved one is gone, when it's too late to ask questions or gather evidence. We need laws that protect our elders before the damage is done, not after. In 2025, Washington passed what they called Margaret's Law. Any will or power of attorney changes involving individuals over 70 or with dementia diagnoses now require independent medical certification of capacity. Notaries must receive specialized training in recognizing cognitive impairment. The penalties for elder financial abuse were tripled. It won't stop every case. Nothing can. But it'll make it harder. It'll give families like mine a fighting chance. Blake was released last month after serving 3 years with good behavior. He didn't contact me. Cassie gets out next spring. I don't know if she will either. Our family, such as it was, ended in that courtroom. Sometimes people ask if I regret the years I spent caring for Mom. If I wish I'd let Blake and Cassie handle it. If I'd stayed in California and preserved my career and my distance. The answer is no. Never. Those 3 years were the hardest of my life. I watched my mother disappear piece by piece, personality and memory dissolving like sugar in water. I changed her, fed her, held her through panic attacks when she couldn't remember where she was. I became the parent, and she became the child, and there was grief in every moment of that reversal. But I was there. When she was frightened, I was the familiar voice. When she was confused, I was the steady hand. And in those rare moments of clarity, when the fog lifted and she was herself again, just for a minute, I got to see recognition in her eyes. Got to hear her say my name and mean it. Blake and Cassie chose greed. They saw our mother's vulnerability as an opportunity, her decline as a business transaction. They calculated the odds and made their play. I chose love. Imperfect, exhausted, sometimes resentful love, but love nonetheless. And in the end, that choice gave me something they'll never have, even when they're released from prison and their fines are paid. Peace.